Hello everyone. Welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we return with another spine-chilling collection of maritime nightmares that have been concealed beneath the waves of secrecy for far too long. In this episode, we will navigate through the treacherous waters of 8 deeply disturbing cruise ship horror stories that will forever change how you view ocean voyages. These accounts have been gathered from survivors who experienced terror on the high seas, where escape is impossible and help is hundreds of miles away. Each story represents the darkest side of what should be luxurious getaways, revealing sinister encounters that occurred in the confined corridors and isolated cabins of massive floating cities. From mysterious cabin intrusions to supernatural crew members, from reality-bending deck discoveries to medical experiments conducted in international waters, these tales expose the horrifying truth that some passengers never truly disembark. The testimonies you will hear tonight have been meticulously verified through passenger manifests, crew reports, and maritime incident databases, though certain identifying details have been modified to protect those who lived through these harrowing ordeals. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Buried Files for daily true horror content that will keep you questioning every shadow. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness surfaces from the depths. I had been looking forward to this cruise for months. After 18 years of marriage that ended in a messy divorce, I finally had the freedom to do something entirely for myself. I booked a 7-night Caribbean cruise on the Celestial Horizon, choosing an interior cabin to keep costs down. What I saved on the room I planned to spend on shore excursions and maybe some much-needed retail therapy. My name is Madison Torres. I am 38 years old and I live in Phoenix, Arizona. I work as a paralegal at a family law firm, so I see the aftermath of broken relationships every day. This cruise was supposed to be my celebration of independence, my chance to rediscover who I was without someone else defining me. The first 2 days went exactly as I had hoped. I attended the fitness classes, tried my hand at the rock climbing wall, and even signed up for salsa lessons. I ate at different restaurants each night, savoring the freedom to choose whatever I wanted without having to consider someone else's preferences. I felt lighter than I had in years, as if the weight of my failed marriage was finally lifting from my shoulders. I made casual conversation with other passengers, but mostly enjoyed the solitude. For the first time in decades, I was completely accountable to no one but myself. My cabin was on deck 6 midship, which meant it was relatively quiet despite being an interior room. The cabin steward, a friendly young man from the Philippines named Rico, had been attentive without being intrusive. He cleaned the room each morning while I was at breakfast and left the traditional towel animals that made me smile. The cabin itself was compact but efficiently designed, with a small sitting area, a queen bed, and a bathroom that made airplane lavatories seem spacious. Most importantly, it had a deadbolt and a security chain. Standard features that I had never given much thought to until this trip. The first sign that something was wrong came on the 3rd night. I had returned to my cabin around 11:30 after spending the evening at the piano bar, listening to a talented musician play everything from Billy Joel to Elton John. I had enjoyed 2 glasses of wine, just enough to make me feel relaxed but not impaired. I used my key card to enter the cabin, engaged the deadbolt and security chain as I always did, and began my nightly routine. I washed my face, brushed my teeth, and changed into my pajamas. The cabin felt secure and comfortable, my private sanctuary floating in the middle of the Caribbean Sea. I fell asleep easily, lulled by the gentle motion of the ship and the distant sound of the ocean. But sometime in the early morning hours, I woke with the distinct feeling that something was different. The room felt colder than usual, and there was a strange quality to the air, as if someone had recently been there. I reached for the bedside lamp and clicked it on, squinting in the sudden brightness. That was when I saw it. My cabin door was standing open about 6 inches, the security chain hanging loose, swaying slightly with the ship's movement. My heart began racing as I tried to process what I was seeing. I knew with absolute certainty that I had secured that door before going to bed. I had checked it twice, a habit developed from years of living alone. I sat up in bed listening intently for any sound that might indicate someone was still in the cabin or nearby. The hallway beyond the open door was dimly lit by emergency lighting, and I could see no movement. But as I looked toward the floor, my blood turned to ice. There were wet footprints leading from the doorway to the side of my bed, dark impressions on the pale carpet that had not been there when I went to sleep. I forced myself to get out of bed and examine the footprints more closely. They were large, definitely from a man's shoe, and they appeared to be from someone who had been walking in water or some other liquid. The prints started at the threshold and led directly to where I had been sleeping, then back toward the door. Someone had entered my cabin while I was asleep, stood beside my bed for an unknown amount of time, and then left. The realization that a stranger had been watching me sleep sent waves of nausea through my body. I immediately called security from the phone beside my bed, my hands shaking as I dialed the emergency number. Within minutes, 2 security officers arrived at my cabin, both professional and courteous, but clearly skeptical of my story. They examined the wet footprints, which were already beginning to fade as the carpet dried. They checked the door mechanism and found no signs of forced entry. When I insisted that I had secured the deadbolt and chain, they suggested that perhaps I had forgotten in my tired state, or that the ship's movement had somehow caused the mechanisms to disengage. The head of security, a woman named Officer Martinez, assured me that they would review the hallway cameras for the time period in question. She also offered to move me to a different cabin if it would help me feel more secure. I declined the room change, partly out of stubbornness and partly because I did not want to let fear dictate my actions. Officer Martinez promised to have extra patrols in my corridor for the remainder of the cruise and gave me her direct number to call if anything else unusual occurred. The next morning, Officer Martinez contacted me with the results of their investigation. The hallway cameras had malfunctioned between midnight and 4 a.m., showing only static during the exact time window when the intrusion would have occurred. She found this suspicious but admitted there was no concrete evidence of foul play. The wet footprints had completely disappeared by morning, leaving no physical proof of what I had experienced. Rico, my cabin steward, swore that he had not entered the room during the night and seemed genuinely concerned about my experience. I tried to put the incident behind me and enjoy the rest of my vacation, but I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder and checking and rechecking my door locks. I spent the 4th day exploring the ship's library and attending a cooking demonstration, activities that kept me busy and around other people. That evening, I joined a group of solo travelers for dinner, grateful for the company and conversation. I returned to my cabin around 10 p.m., deliberately earlier than the previous night, hoping that an earlier bedtime might prevent another incident. Once again, I secured the door carefully, testing both the deadbolt and chain multiple times. I even placed a chair against the door as an additional barrier, though I knew it would not stop someone with a keycard. I left a light on in the bathroom and kept the television on at low volume, hoping that signs of activity might deter any potential intruder. Despite my precautions, I had difficulty falling asleep, listening to every sound in the hallway and startling at the normal creaks and groans of the ship. I woke again in the early morning hours, this time to find something even more disturbing than an open door. My door was still securely locked and chained, exactly as I had left it. But on the small table beside my bed, someone had left a single red rose and a handwritten note. My hands trembled as I picked up the note, which was written in neat block letters on ship stationery. It read, "You look so peaceful when you sleep. I hope you are enjoying your vacation as much as I am enjoying watching you." This time, when I called security, Officer Martinez arrived within 3 minutes, accompanied by 2 additional officers. They could not explain how someone had entered my locked cabin without triggering the door mechanisms or being detected by the cameras, which were supposedly functioning normally by this point in the cruise. The rose was a common variety available in the ship's gift shops, and the stationery was standard in every cabin. There were no fingerprints on either item other than my own. The investigation expanded to include interviews with crew members who had access to master key cards and passengers who had been seen in my corridor. Rico was questioned extensively but maintained his innocence, and his alibi checked out through security logs and witness statements. The officers reviewed the passenger manifest for anyone with a history of stalking or similar offenses, but found nothing that raised immediate red flags. Officer Martinez admitted that they were dealing with someone who understood the ship's security systems and had found a way to circumvent them. For the remaining 3 nights of the cruise, I was moved to a cabin directly across from the security office, and Officer Martinez personally ensured that someone was monitoring my corridor at all times. I also began sleeping with a chair wedged under the door handle and my phone ready to dial security at the first sign of trouble. The incident stopped after the room change, but I never felt truly safe for the remainder of the voyage. On the final morning, as I was packing to disembark, Rico knocked on my door to deliver my final towel animal and retrieve his tip. As he was leaving, he turned back and said something that chilled me to the bone. He mentioned that the passenger in my original cabin had been asking about me, wanting to know which excursions I had booked and what my plans were for the final day. When I asked him to describe this passenger, Rico described a middle-aged man with dark hair who claimed to be my friend from back home. I had not spoken to any middle-aged men during the entire cruise and certainly had not mentioned my personal information to anyone who fit that description. Rico realized his mistake immediately and apologized profusely, explaining that the man had seemed so confident and knowledgeable about me that Rico had assumed we were acquainted. He promised to report this information to security immediately. The final revelation came as I was leaving the ship. Officer Martinez pulled me aside to inform me that they had identified a crew member who had been dismissed from his previous position for inappropriate behavior toward female passengers. He had somehow managed to obtain employment on the Celestial Horizon using falsified references and had been working in the housekeeping department with access to master key cards. However, by the time they discovered his identity, he had already disembarked at the previous port and disappeared. As I finally stepped off that ship and onto solid ground, I realized that my celebration of independence had become something entirely different. I had learned that even in the middle of the ocean, surrounded by thousands of people, you could still be completely vulnerable to someone with malicious intentions. The experience had taught me to trust my instincts and never dismiss signs of danger, no matter how impossible they might seem. To this day, I still check my hotel room doors multiple times when I travel, and I never sleep without ensuring that every possible entry point is secured. The memory of those wet footprints and that handwritten note serves as a constant reminder that predators can find you anywhere, even in places where you should feel safe and protected. My name is Patricia Nguyen, and I live in Houston, Texas, where I work as a pediatric nurse at Texas Children's Hospital. The reason I am sharing this story is not because I expect anyone to believe it, but because I need to document what happened to my family during what was supposed to be a celebration of my grandmother's 80th birthday. Our extended family had planned this cruise for over a year, booking 14 cabins on the oceanic grandeur to accommodate everyone from my elderly aunts to my youngest cousin's newborn baby. It was meant to be a once-in-a-lifetime gathering, a chance for 3 generations to create memories together on a beautiful ship sailing through the Eastern Caribbean. The planning had been extensive and expensive. My Aunt Linda, who organized family events with military precision, had spent months coordinating everyone's schedules and ensuring that all the cabins were located on the same deck so we could easily visit each other. She had requested Deck 7 specifically because it was high enough to have good ocean views but low enough to avoid excessive elevator waits with elderly family members. When we received our cabin assignment 6 weeks before departure, everything seemed perfect. The family was distributed across cabins 7A through 7N, a neat row that would make it easy for my grandmother to visit everyone without having to navigate the complexities of a massive cruise ship. The first sign that something was wrong came when we were checking in at the terminal in Fort Lauderdale. My Aunt Linda had arrived early, as was her habit, and was going through the cabin assignments with the guest services representative to ensure everything was correct. She had brought along the ship's deck plan that she had downloaded from the cruise line's website, and she was marking off each cabin location as the representative confirmed the reservations. That was when the representative, a young woman named Jessica, paused and looked confused. According to Jessica's computer system, there was no cabin 7B listed on Deck 7. In fact, the cabin numbers on that deck went directly from 7A to 7C, with no 7B in between. Linda insisted that she had specifically requested and been assigned cabin 7B for my elderly Aunt Rose, who needed to be close to the elevator but away from high traffic areas. Jessica pulled up the ship's official deck plan on her computer, and indeed there was no 7B shown on the diagram. The cabins were numbered sequentially, but 7B simply did not exist according to the ship's records. Linda was understandably frustrated and demanded to speak with a supervisor. The supervisor, a man named Robert with 20 years of cruise industry experience, reviewed the situation and confirmed that there had been some sort of administrative error. According to him, cabin 7B had never existed on the Oceanic Grandeur, and he could not explain how Linda had been able to book a non-existent cabin. He assured her that they would resolve the situation by upgrading Aunt Rose to a comparable cabin on a different deck at no additional charge. But Linda was not satisfied with this explanation. She had the original confirmation email on her phone, clearly showing the booking for cabin 7B, along with the deck plan she had downloaded months earlier that definitely included 7B between 7A and 7C. Robert examined the email and admitted that it appeared legitimate, complete with the cruise line's official formatting and confirmation numbers. However, he maintained that their current system showed no record of such a cabin ever existing, and suggested that perhaps there had been a website error or outdated information that had since been corrected. The rest of the family arrived at the terminal while this discussion was ongoing, and soon everyone was involved in trying to solve the mystery of the missing cabin. My cousin David, who works in information technology, examined the deck plan on his laptop and confirmed that online resources now showed no cabin 7B. However, my Aunt Rose distinctly remembered seeing 7B on the deck plan when she had reviewed the family's cabin assignments just 2 weeks earlier. She even had notes in her planner about which cabin was hers, written in her careful handwriting. Cabin 7B, Deck 7, port side near elevator. Eventually, we had to accept Robert's solution and allow Aunt Rose to be relocated to Deck 6. But the incident had left several family members unsettled, particularly those who were certain they had seen 7B on the ship's layout during the planning process. As we boarded the ship and made our way to our cabins, Linda suggested that we should explore Deck 7 together to see for ourselves how the cabin numbering actually worked. What we discovered was even more confusing than the check-in experience had been. Walking along the port-side corridor of Deck 7, we found Cabin 7A, then immediately next to it, Cabin 7C. But the space between them seemed wrong somehow. The corridor appeared to be wider than it should be, and there was a section of wall that looked different from the rest, as if it had been modified or covered over. The carpet pattern was also slightly mismatched in that area, with a newer section that did not quite align with the older surrounding flooring. My cousin David, being naturally curious and somewhat skeptical of the official explanation, began examining the wall area more closely. He noticed that the wall panels in the questionable section were attached differently than the others, with screws instead of the decorative fasteners used elsewhere. More intriguingly, he could feel air movement along the bottom edge of one panel, suggesting that there might be a hollow space behind it. When he pressed against the panel, it seemed to give slightly, as if it were not securely attached to a solid surface. Linda, who had been taking photos of the corridor to document the discrepancy, noticed something else unusual. The room numbers on either side of the corridor did not align properly with the space available. Based on the standard cabin size throughout the ship, there should have been enough room for an additional cabin between 7A and 7C, yet the corridor appeared to have been designed as if that space did not exist. The emergency evacuation map posted at the end of the corridor showed the same gap, with cabin numbers jumping from 7A to 7C. That evening, several family members experienced strange occurrences that we initially attributed to the excitement and unfamiliarity of being on a cruise ship. Aunt Rose, who had been relocated to Deck 6, complained that she could hear voices and movement from the cabin directly above hers on Deck 7, even though that location should have been the non-existent Cabin 7B. My Uncle Frank, staying in Cabin 7A, reported that his bathroom seemed unusually cold and that he occasionally heard what sounded like running water from the direction of the adjoining wall. The most disturbing incident occurred around 2 a.m. when my teenage nephew Marcus was returning to his family's cabin after visiting the 24-hour buffet. As he walked down the Deck 7 corridor, he noticed that the door to Cabin 7B was standing open, with light spilling out into the hallway. Curious and somewhat confused, since he knew that cabin was supposed to not exist, Marcus approached the doorway and looked inside. What he saw defied logical explanation. The cabin appeared to be fully furnished and occupied, with personal belongings scattered around and evidence of recent use. There were suitcases on the bed, toiletries in the bathroom, and family photos displayed on the small desk. Most shocking of all, there were people inside. An elderly couple sitting on the small sofa, reading books and appearing completely normal. When Marcus cleared his throat to get their attention, the woman looked up and smiled, asking if he was enjoying his cruise. Startled and confused, Marcus mumbled a response and quickly backed away from the doorway. But as he turned to leave, he heard the woman mention that they were celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary, and that this was their third cruise on the Oceanic Grandeur. Marcus practically ran back to his family's cabin, but when he tried to explain what he had seen, the adults dismissed it as a case of mistaken location or perhaps a crew cabin that he had misidentified. The next morning, Marcus insisted on showing his father the mysterious cabin, but when they returned to the corridor, there was no door where 7B should have been. The wall appeared solid and unbroken, exactly as it had when we first explored the area. Marcus was certain about what he had seen, but the physical evidence contradicted his account. His father suggested that perhaps the dim corridor lighting and unfamiliar surroundings had created an optical illusion, or that Marcus had been more tired than he realized after his late-night snack adventure. But Marcus was not the only family member to experience something unusual in that area of the ship. Over the next several days, different relatives reported strange encounters while walking past the location where Cabin 7B should have been. My Aunt Linda heard music playing from behind the wall, specifically big band music from the 1940s that seemed to be coming from a radio or record player. My cousin Sarah smelled pipe tobacco in the corridor, even though smoking was prohibited throughout the ship and none of our family members smoked. Most unsettling of all was my grandmother's experience on the fourth night of the cruise. She had been unable to sleep and decided to take a short walk in the corridor to help herself relax. As she approached the area between cabins 7A and 7C, she saw a woman about her own age standing in front of what appeared to be a cabin door. The woman was wearing a formal dress from several decades earlier and seemed to be waiting for someone to answer her knock. My grandmother, being naturally social and concerned about a fellow elderly passenger who might be lost or confused, approached the woman and asked if she needed assistance. The woman turned and smiled, explaining that she was waiting for her husband to finish getting ready for the formal dinner that evening. She mentioned that they always dressed up for the captain's dinner, even though it made them a bit late for the evening's activities. What disturbed my grandmother was not the conversation itself, but the gradual realization that the woman was describing events from decades in the past. She mentioned the ship's band playing songs that had not been popular since the 1960s, and she referenced dining room procedures that were no longer used on modern cruise ships. When my grandmother mentioned that the current date was 2023, the woman looked confused and insisted that it was 1967 and that she and her husband were on their honeymoon cruise. As their conversation continued, my grandmother began to notice other troubling details. The woman's clothing, while elegant, appeared to be fading or becoming translucent. Her voice seemed to be coming from a great distance, even though she was standing just a few feet away. Most disturbing of all, when my grandmother looked down at the floor, she could see the corridor carpeting through the woman's shoes, as if she were not entirely solid. The encounter ended abruptly when the woman suddenly looked alarmed and insisted that she had to return to her cabin because her husband would be worried. She walked directly toward the wall between cabin 7A and 7C, and instead of stopping or turning away, she simply disappeared into the solid surface as if it were an open doorway. My grandmother stood alone in the corridor, staring at the blank wall and trying to process what she had just witnessed. The next morning, my grandmother shared her experience with the family, and we decided that we needed to investigate further. Linda contacted the ship's guest services and requested a meeting with someone who could provide historical information about the vessel. We were eventually connected with the ship's historian, an elderly man named Captain Reynolds, who had worked for the cruise line for over 40 years and specialized in the maritime heritage of their fleet. Captain Reynolds listened to our questions about cabin 7B with obvious discomfort and eventually admitted that there was indeed a complicated history surrounding that particular location on Deck 7. According to his records, the Oceanic Grandeur had been built using materials and design elements from several older ships that had been decommissioned in the 1960s and 1970s. One of those ships, the Caribbean Princess, had suffered a tragic accident during its final voyage in 1967 when a fire broke out in the cabin area that would eventually become Deck 7 of the new ship. The fire had resulted in several passenger deaths, including an elderly honeymoon couple who had been trapped in their cabin when the corridor filled with smoke. Captain Reynolds explained that when the new ship was constructed, the designers had deliberately omitted cabin 7B from the layout as a tribute to the passengers who had died in that location on the original vessel. However, the physical space still existed behind the wall, and it had been sealed off rather than incorporated into the adjacent cabins. What Captain Reynolds could not explain was how passengers in the present day were experiencing interactions with people who had died over 50 years earlier. He acknowledged that there had been occasional reports of unusual activities in that area of the ship, but the cruise line generally attributed such incidents to passenger imagination or the disorienting effects of being at sea. He assured us that the wall separating the corridor from the sealed space was solid, and that there was no way for anyone to access the area behind it. But his explanation raised more questions than it answered. If Cabin 7B had been deliberately omitted from the ship's design, how had Linda been able to book it initially? Why did some family members have clear memories of seeing it on the deck plans? And most importantly, what were we actually experiencing when we encountered the people who seemed to be occupying that impossible space? We never found satisfactory answers to these questions, and the rest of our cruise was completed without further incident. However, several family members continued to report unusual dreams and experiences related to the missing cabin even after we returned home. My Aunt Rose mentioned that she sometimes woke up feeling as if she were still in Cabin 7B, surrounded by furnishings and belongings that were not her own. The most lasting effect of our experience was the way it changed how we thought about the nature of reality and the possibility that some spaces exist outside of normal physical laws. We had encountered something that should not have been possible, yet multiple family members had witnessed aspects of it independently. Whether we had experienced a supernatural phenomenon, a dimensional anomaly, or something else entirely, we could not deny that Cabin 7B had somehow existed for us, even though it was not supposed to be there. To this day, none of us can fully explain what happened during that cruise, but we all agree that some mysteries are too complex to be resolved through conventional investigation. The missing cabin remains a family legend, a reminder that the world contains more strange and inexplicable phenomena than most people are willing to acknowledge. My name is Jake Morrison, and I have been working on cruise ships for the better part of 12 years. I grew up in Portland, Maine, in a family where the sea was not just our livelihood but our heritage. My father worked the lobster boats, my grandfather before him, and when I decided I wanted to see more of the world than the rocky coast of Maine, cruise ships seemed like the natural progression. I started as a junior engineer and worked my way up to senior maintenance technician, specializing in the massive diesel engines that power these floating cities across the oceans. The work is demanding, often thankless, and always takes place in the bowels of the ship where passengers never venture. While they dance and dine above, we ensure that the lights stay on, the air conditioning runs, and the massive propulsion systems keep turning. It is hot, noisy, and sometimes dangerous work, but I have always found satisfaction in keeping these mechanical marvels operational. The engine room of a modern cruise ship is a cathedral of steel and machinery, with engines the size of small buildings and systems so complex that it takes years to fully understand them all. I joined the crew of the Royal Majesty in February of 2023, signing on for a 6-month contract that would take us through the Caribbean, Mediterranean, and Northern European routes. The ship was relatively new, launched just 3 years earlier, with state-of-the-art engines and computerized systems that made the older vessels I had worked on seem primitive by comparison. The engineering crew consisted of 8 men from various countries, and we worked in rotating shifts to ensure 24-hour coverage of the critical systems. The night shift was my preference, running from midnight to 8 a.m. During these hours, the ship settled into a different rhythm. The passengers were asleep, the entertainment venues were closed, and the crew areas took on an almost peaceful quality despite the constant thrum of the engines. It was during these quiet hours that I could focus on preventive maintenance, system diagnostics, and the detailed inspections that kept everything running smoothly. I had been working nights for so many years that I had become naturally nocturnal, sleeping during the day while the ship buzzed with activity above. It was during my 3rd week aboard the Royal Majesty that I first encountered the man who would change everything. I was conducting routine checks on engine number 2 when I heard someone approaching from behind. Turning around, I saw a fellow crew member I had not met before, wearing the same blue coveralls that all engine room personnel wore. He was older, perhaps in his 60s, with weathered skin and hands that showed the calluses and scars of decades spent working with machinery. He introduced himself as Thomas Erickson and explained that he was filling in for one of the regular crew members who had taken ill. His accent suggested Northern European origins, possibly Norwegian or Danish, and he spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent his entire career in engine rooms. What struck me most was his knowledge of the ship's systems, which seemed far more comprehensive than what a temporary replacement worker should possess. He knew the location of every valve, the specifications of every pump, and the operating procedures for systems that were unique to this particular vessel. Thomas worked alongside me for the remainder of that shift, and I found his company both helpful and oddly comforting. He had stories from decades of maritime service, tales of storms weathered and mechanical crises averted through skill and determination. There was something about his presence that made the vast, lonely engine room feel less isolated. When our shift ended at 8 a.m., he mentioned that he would be working nights for the foreseeable future and looked forward to our continued collaboration. Over the following weeks, Thomas became my regular night shift partner, though I never saw him during shift changes or crew meetings. When I asked the chief engineer about our new temporary crew member, he seemed confused and insisted that no additional personnel had been assigned to the night shift. When I described Thomas in detail, the chief engineer checked the crew roster and assured me that no one matching that description was employed on the ship. I found this response puzzling, but assumed there had been some administrative oversight or miscommunication. Thomas continued to appear each night, always arriving after I had begun my shift and leaving before the day crew took over. His knowledge of the ship's systems proved invaluable on several occasions. He identified a bearing that was beginning to fail days before our diagnostic equipment detected the problem. He spotted a coolant leak that could have resulted in serious engine damage if left unaddressed. Each time, his warnings proved accurate, and the repairs he suggested were exactly what the situation required. But as the weeks progressed, I began to notice disturbing aspects of Thomas's behavior and appearance. His coveralls, while clean and proper, seemed to be of an older style than what the ship currently issued. The name patch on his chest was slightly faded, as if it had been worn for many years. More troubling was the fact that Thomas never seemed to eat or drink during our long shifts, declining offers of coffee or snacks with polite but firm refusals. The turning point came during our 5th week working together. We were conducting maintenance on the main propulsion system when Thomas suddenly stopped what he was doing and listened intently to sounds that I could not hear above the normal engine noise. His face grew grave as he turned to me and said that we needed to shut down engine number 3 immediately. When I asked why, he explained that a catastrophic failure was imminent and that continuing to operate the engine would result in an explosion that could kill us both. I had no reason to doubt Thomas given his previous accuracy, but shutting down a main engine during normal operations required authorization from the bridge and would cause significant disruption to the ship's schedule. Thomas insisted that there was no time for proper procedures and began the shutdown sequence himself. Within minutes of the engine going offline, alarms began sounding throughout the engine room. A critical component had indeed failed, and if the engine had continued operating, the resulting damage could have been catastrophic. The incident was investigated thoroughly by both the ship's officers and representatives from the cruise line. The failed component showed signs of metal fatigue that our routine inspections had not detected, and the investigators concluded that the shutdown had prevented a disaster that could have endangered the entire ship. When I explained that Thomas had identified the problem, the investigators wanted to interview him immediately. But despite searching the entire ship, Thomas was nowhere to be found. The chief engineer pulled me aside and explained something that made my blood run cold. According to the ship's records, there had been no temporary crew member assigned to the night shift. More disturbing was the discovery that a senior engineer named Thomas Erickson had indeed worked on cruise ships for over 30 years. but he had died in an engine room accident aboard another vessel in this same fleet nearly 2 decades earlier. The description I provided matched perfectly with photographs from his personnel file. I tried to rationalize what I had experienced, convincing myself that stress and long hours had somehow created an elaborate hallucination. But the physical evidence was undeniable. The maintenance work that Thomas and I had performed together had been completed by someone with expert knowledge and skill. Tools had been moved, systems had been adjusted, and repairs had been made that I could not have accomplished alone in the time available. Thomas continued to appear during my night shifts, but our interactions took on a different quality after I learned the truth about his identity. He seemed aware that I knew who he really was, and his demeanor became more serious and urgent. He began sharing information about other potential problems with the ship's systems, predicting failures and maintenance issues with the same uncanny accuracy he had always displayed. But his assistance came with an increasingly disturbing price. Thomas began asking me to perform tasks that had nothing to do with routine maintenance. He wanted me to adjust settings on critical systems, to bypass safety protocols, and to make modifications that could affect the ship's navigation and stability. When I refused or questioned these requests, Thomas would become agitated and insistent, explaining that these changes were necessary to prevent disasters that only he could foresee. The situation reached a crisis point during my 8th week aboard the Royal Majesty. Thomas appeared more solid and real than ever before, but his requests had become demands that bordered on threats. He insisted that I shut down the ship's main electrical grid for exactly 17 minutes while he made adjustments to systems I was not authorized to access. When I refused, Thomas grabbed my arm with surprising strength and insisted that hundreds of lives depended on my cooperation. For the first time since our initial meeting, I felt genuine fear in Thomas's presence. The helpful, knowledgeable engineer had been replaced by something desperate and potentially dangerous. I realized that whatever Thomas had become in the years since his death, he was no longer entirely benevolent. His desire to prevent disasters had evolved into an obsession that might itself become the source of the very catastrophes he claimed to want to prevent. I made the difficult decision to request a transfer to the day shift, citing personal reasons that I could not fully explain to my superiors. The chief engineer accommodated my request, though he expressed concern about my apparent stress and suggested that I consider taking some shore leave to recover from what had obviously been a challenging assignment. On my final night shift, Thomas appeared one last time. He seemed to understand that I would no longer be working the midnight hours, and his expression was one of disappointment rather than anger. Before disappearing into the maze of pipes and machinery, he warned me that the ship would face its greatest crisis within the next lunar cycle, and that without his guidance, the outcome would be beyond anyone's ability to prevent. I completed my contract aboard the Royal Majesty and transferred to another vessel, but I continued to monitor news reports about the ship. Exactly 28 days after my last encounter with Thomas, the Royal Majesty experienced a major engine room fire that required emergency evacuation of passengers and crew. No lives were lost, but the ship was severely damaged and remained in dry dock for months of repairs. I never returned to night shift work after my experience with Thomas Erickson. The encounter taught me that some prices are too high to pay, even for the most valuable assistance. The dead, I learned, do not always rest peacefully, and their unfinished business can become a burden for the living that grows heavier with each passing day. My name is Trevor Williams, and I work as a financial advisor in Nashville, Tennessee. I married my college sweetheart Ashley 3 years ago, and we had planned our honeymoon cruise to the Mediterranean as the perfect way to celebrate our new life together. We booked a 7-night voyage on the majestic Voyager, departing from Barcelona and visiting ports throughout Italy and France. Ashley had spent months researching the ship and planning every detail of our itinerary, from shore excursions to dinner reservations at the specialty restaurants. This was meant to be the trip of a lifetime, our first major adventure as husband and wife. The majestic Voyager was an impressive vessel, one of the newer ships in the fleet with 15 passenger decks offering everything from rock-climbing walls to Broadway-style shows. Ashley and I had requested a midship cabin on Deck 8, close enough to the main activities but high enough to avoid the noise from the lower decks. Our cabin had a small balcony overlooking the ocean, and we spent our first evening watching the sun set over the Mediterranean while sipping champagne and planning the next day's exploration of the ship. Ashley had brought along multiple copies of the ship's deck plan, which she had annotated with notes about restaurants, bars, and activities she wanted to try. She approached our honeymoon with the same methodical planning that had made her successful in her career as a project manager. I found her enthusiasm endearing, even if I preferred a more spontaneous approach to vacation planning. We agreed that we would spend the first full day at sea exploring the ship together, getting our bearings before we reached our first port in Rome. The morning of our second day dawned clear and calm, with barely a breeze disturbing the surface of the Mediterranean. After breakfast, Ashley pulled out her deck plans and suggested that we start at the top of the ship and work our way down, systematically visiting each deck to get a complete picture of what the majestic Voyager had to offer. We began on Deck 15, which housed the rock-climbing wall and sports court, then worked our way down through the various entertainment and dining venues. It was on Deck 12 that we encountered the first discrepancy between Ashley's carefully researched deck plans and the actual layout of the ship. According to her primary deck plan downloaded from the cruise line's official website, Deck 12 should have contained the main library, a quiet lounge area, and several meeting rooms. However, when we reached Deck 12 using the central elevator bank, we found ourselves in what appeared to be an outdoor recreation area with shuffleboard courts and a putting green. Ashley was immediately concerned that we had somehow gotten lost or confused about our location, but the deck number was clearly marked on the elevator landing, and the emergency evacuation maps confirmed that we were indeed on Deck 12. She pulled out a second deck plan that she had printed from a different source, and this one showed the outdoor recreation area exactly as we found it. When she compared the two plans side by side, she realized that they were substantially different, not just in small details but in major layout features. Thinking that perhaps one of the deck plans was outdated or from a different ship in the same class, Ashley suggested that we visit the guest services desk to get an official current deck plan. The guest services representative, a friendly woman named Maria, provided us with what she assured us was the most current and accurate deck plan available. However, when Ashley compared this third version to the two she already had, she discovered that it differed from both of them in significant ways. Most puzzling was the fact that all three deck plans showed different information for several decks, but they were particularly inconsistent about Deck 13. Ashley's original plan showed Deck 13 as containing a spa and fitness center. The second plan indicated it was a crew-only area, and the official plan from guest services showed it as a combination of retail shops and a small casino. Intrigued by these discrepancies and somewhat frustrated by the lack of reliable information, Ashley suggested that we investigate Deck 13 directly to determine which plan was accurate. When we reached Deck 13 using the same central elevator bank, we discovered something that none of the deck plans had prepared us for. The elevator doors opened onto what appeared to be an outdoor promenade deck, complete with deck chairs, planters full of flowers, and a stunning view of the Mediterranean Sea. The area was beautifully maintained and clearly designed for passenger use, but it was completely empty despite the perfect weather and the fact that it was mid-morning when many passengers would typically be seeking outdoor relaxation areas. The most striking feature of this deck was the quality of light, which seemed different from what we had experienced elsewhere on the ship. Despite the fact that it was clearly daytime, the light had a soft, golden quality that reminded me of late afternoon or early evening. The shadows cast by the deck furniture and planters seemed longer and more defined than they should have been given the position of the sun. Ashley noticed this unusual lighting immediately and commented that it made the entire deck feel like it existed in a different time zone. As we explored this unexpected outdoor area, we encountered other passengers who were enjoying the peaceful atmosphere. There was an elderly couple reading books in deck chairs near the railing, a middle-aged woman doing watercolor painting at a small table, and several other individuals who appeared to be relaxing and enjoying the ocean view. What struck us as odd was that none of these passengers acknowledged our presence, despite our walking directly past them and Ashley's attempts to make friendly conversation. The elderly couple in particular seemed oblivious to our presence. When Ashley stopped near their chairs and commented on the beautiful weather, they continued reading without any response or even a glance in our direction. The woman painting looked up briefly when I accidentally bumped into her table, but her gaze seemed to pass right through me as if I were not there. It was as if we were invisible to the other passengers on this deck. Or perhaps they were somehow invisible to us except visually. Ashley and I spent about an hour exploring this mysterious deck, trying to understand how it could exist when none of the official deck plans had accurately described it. We took numerous photos of the area, including shots of the deck number signs and the emergency evacuation information posted near the elevators. The signs confirmed that we were on deck 13, but the evacuation map showed a layout that matched none of the 3 deck plans Ashley had collected. When we finally decided to return to our cabin to review our photos and plan the rest of our exploration, we discovered that the elevator bank we had used to reach deck 13 was no longer accessible from that location. The area where the elevators should have been was now occupied by a solid wall with decorative paneling. Ashley and I searched the entire perimeter of the deck, looking for any elevator or stairway that would allow us to leave, but we found no exits other than the solid railing that surrounded the outdoor area. Growing concerned about our situation, I tried to use my cell phone to call guest services, but discovered that I had no signal despite the fact that the ship's communication systems had been working perfectly throughout our voyage. Ashley's phone also showed no signal, and neither of our phones could connect to the ship's internet service. It was as if this deck existed in a communication dead zone, isolated from the rest of the ship's systems. After nearly 2 hours of searching for an exit, Ashley and I were beginning to feel genuinely trapped when she noticed something that had not been there when we first arrived. Near the center of the deck, there was now a narrow stairway leading downward, constructed of the same materials as the rest of the ship, but appearing somehow newer or more recently installed. The stairway had not been there during our initial exploration, and neither of us could explain how it had appeared. With few other options available, we decided to use the mysterious stairway to leave deck 13. The stairway led down 1 level and opened onto deck 12, but not the outdoor recreation area we had visited earlier. Instead, we found ourselves in the library and quiet lounge area that Ashley's original deck plan had indicated should be located on this deck. The layout matched her first deck plan exactly, contradicting what we had seen during our earlier visit to this same location. Confused and somewhat disturbed by these spatial inconsistencies, we decided to return to our cabin and seek assistance from guest services. However, when we reached the central elevator bank on deck 12, we discovered that the button for deck 13 was no longer illuminated on the elevator control panel. In fact, the elevator seemed to skip directly from deck 12 to deck 14, as if deck 13 no longer existed as an accessible destination. Ashley and I returned to guest services to report our strange experience and to request clarification about the ship's actual layout. Maria, the same representative who had provided us with the official deck plan earlier, listened to our account with obvious skepticism. When Ashley showed her the photos we had taken on Deck 13, Maria's expression changed from skepticism to confusion and then to what appeared to be genuine concern. According to Maria, the photos showed areas of the ship that she did not recognize, despite her 2 years of experience working on the majestic Voyager. She consulted with her supervisor and then returned to inform us that Deck 13 was indeed a restricted crew area that was not accessible to passengers. She could not explain how we had gained access to the area or how we had managed to photograph locations that did not match any of the ship's official layouts. The supervisor, a man named Captain Rodriguez, reviewed our photos and admitted that they showed areas that were not part of the ship's current configuration. He suggested that perhaps we had somehow accessed a section of the ship that was under renovation or had been modified since the most recent deck plans were created. However, he could not explain the discrepancies between the multiple deck plans Ashley had collected or the spatial impossibilities we had experienced. Captain Rodriguez promised to investigate our report and to ensure that any unsecured areas of the ship were properly restricted to prevent other passengers from experiencing similar confusion. He also offered to provide us with a guided tour of the ship's public areas to help us navigate more effectively for the remainder of our cruise. We accepted his offer, but the guided tour only revealed more inconsistencies between the ship's actual layout and the various deck plans that were supposed to represent it accurately. For the remainder of our honeymoon cruise, Ashley and I found ourselves constantly questioning what we were seeing and experiencing. Deck layouts seemed to change depending on how we accessed them, and areas that should have been familiar became strange and unfamiliar when approached from different directions. We began to suspect that the majestic Voyager was not a single, consistent physical space, but rather a collection of overlapping realities that shifted based on unknown factors. The most disturbing realization came on our final night aboard the ship. Ashley was reviewing all the photos from our voyage when she noticed that the pictures we had taken on the mysterious Deck 13 showed not just the areas we remembered visiting, but also the other passengers we had encountered there. However, in every photo, those passengers appeared translucent and ethereal, as if they were not entirely present in the same physical space we had occupied. When we returned home to Nashville and shared our experience with friends and family, most people suggested that we had simply been confused by the complex layout of a large cruise ship. However, Ashley's methodical documentation of our experience, including the multiple conflicting deck plans and the photographs that showed impossible spaces, convinced us that we had encountered something beyond normal spatial reality. To this day, we cannot fully explain what happened during our exploration of the majestic Voyager. We had intended to celebrate our new marriage with a relaxing cruise through the Mediterranean. But instead, we discovered that some ships contain spaces that exist outside the normal rules of architecture and physics. The experience brought us closer together as we learned to trust our shared perceptions even when they contradicted conventional logic. But it also left us with questions about the nature of reality that we may never be able to answer. My name is Carmen Rodriguez, and I work as a maritime historian at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque. I have spent the last 15 years researching the history of passenger ships, particularly focusing on vessels that met tragic ends during the golden age of ocean travel. My fascination with maritime disasters began during my graduate studies when I wrote my thesis on the engineering failures that led to several notable shipwrecks in the early 20th century. This expertise made me the perfect candidate for what I thought would be a relaxing research cruise aboard the Atlantic Majesty, a modern vessel that I had discovered incorporated materials and design elements from several historic ships. The Atlantic Majesty was part of a fleet that prided itself on combining modern luxury with traditional maritime heritage. According to the cruise line's marketing materials, the ship had been constructed using salvaged materials from decommissioned ocean liners, including brass fixtures, wooden paneling, and even structural components from vessels that had served during the golden age of transatlantic travel. As a maritime historian, I found this concept fascinating and had booked the cruise specifically to study how these historic elements had been integrated into a contemporary vessel. I had spent months researching the provenance of the Atlantic Majesty's historic components, tracing their origins through maritime archives and shipyard records. What I discovered was both intriguing and disturbing. Many of the materials had come from the SS Britannica, a luxury liner that had sunk in 1934 during a violent storm in the North Atlantic. The Britannica had been attempting to maintain her schedule despite increasingly dangerous weather conditions when a series of mechanical failures led to her foundering with significant loss of life. The most troubling aspect of the Britannica disaster was the role played by her captain, a man named Edmund Blackwood, who had refused to alter course or reduce speed despite repeated warnings from his officers about the deteriorating weather conditions. Captain Blackwood had been known throughout his career for his rigid adherence to schedules and his refusal to allow weather or mechanical issues to interfere with his ship's operations. His inflexibility had ultimately cost him his life, along with those of nearly 300 passengers and crew members. During my first few days aboard the Atlantic Majesty, I spent considerable time examining the historic elements that had been incorporated into the ship's design. The main dining room featured ornate brass chandeliers that had originally hung in the Britannica's first-class restaurant, and the ship's library contained wooden bookcases and reading tables that had been salvaged from the same vessel. Most impressive was the bridge, which incorporated the original ship's wheel and compass housing from the Britannica, beautifully restored and integrated into the modern navigation systems. It was while I was photographing these historic elements for my research that I first encountered Captain Blackwood, though I did not immediately realize who he was. I was on the bridge during a scheduled tour when I noticed a man in an old-style naval uniform standing near the original ship's wheel, examining the brass compass housing with obvious familiarity. He was tall and distinguished, with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. What struck me as odd was that his uniform was not the modern style worn by the Atlantic Majesty's officers, but rather the traditional double-breasted jacket and peaked cap that had been standard in the 1930s. When I approached him to ask about the historic elements on the bridge, he turned and smiled with genuine warmth. He introduced himself simply as Captain Blackwood and began sharing detailed information about the brass fixtures and their original installation on what he called my previous command. His knowledge was encyclopedic, including technical specifications and maintenance procedures that I had not been able to find in any of my archival research. He spoke with obvious affection about the craftsmanship and attention to detail that had gone into the original construction. As our conversation continued, I began to notice details about Captain Blackwood that seemed inconsistent with his being a member of the Atlantic Majesty's crew. His uniform, while immaculate, appeared to be authentic vintage rather than a modern reproduction. More disturbing was his casual reference to events and people from the 1930s as if they were recent occurrences. He mentioned weather patterns and shipping routes that had not been used for decades, and he spoke about other ships and their captains using present tense as if they were still actively sailing. When I asked Captain Blackwood about his current role aboard the Atlantic Majesty, his response was evasive but troubling. He explained that he had been reassigned to ensure that the ship maintained proper standards and that her schedule was not compromised by unnecessary delays or deviations. He spoke with obvious pride about his reputation for punctuality and his commitment to getting passengers to their destinations on time regardless of challenging conditions. Over the following days, I encountered Captain Blackwood several more times, always in areas of the ship that featured historic elements from the Britannica. He seemed to be conducting inspections of these areas, checking the condition of brass fixtures and examining the integration of historic components with modern systems. During these encounters, he began sharing increasingly detailed information about proper ship operations, emphasizing the importance of maintaining course and speed even when conditions became difficult. What began as informative conversations gradually took on a more urgent tone as Captain Blackwood became convinced that the Atlantic Majesty's current officers were not maintaining adequate standards. He criticized their willingness to alter course for weather, their conservative approach to speed management, and their tendency to prioritize passenger comfort over schedule adherence. He insisted that modern captains had become too cautious and that ships like the Atlantic Majesty were capable of far more aggressive operations than their current crews were willing to attempt. The situation became alarming when Captain Blackwood began suggesting specific operational changes that he believed were necessary to improve the ship's performance. He wanted the officers to increase speed during rough weather, to maintain course despite storm warnings, and to prioritize schedule adherence over safety protocols. When I pointed out that such operations would be dangerous and potentially illegal under modern maritime regulations, he became agitated and insisted that excessive caution was more dangerous than bold seamanship. Captain Blackwood's influence on the ship's operations became apparent during our fourth night at sea when we encountered a significant storm system that was moving across our planned route. The Atlantic Majesty's captain had announced that we would be altering course slightly to avoid the worst of the weather, resulting in a delay of approximately 2 hours in our arrival at the next port. This decision, which seemed entirely reasonable given the safety of the passengers and crew, sent Captain Blackwood into a fury. I found him on the bridge that night, standing near the historic ship's wheel and speaking in urgent tones to someone I could not see. He was insisting that the course change was unnecessary and cowardly, and that a real captain would maintain his original route regardless of weather conditions. As I watched, the ship's wheel began to move on its own, turning slowly but steadily in the direction that would have taken us back to the original course and directly into the storm. The modern navigation systems immediately detected the course change and alerted the bridge officers, who quickly corrected the ship's heading and increased security around the bridge area. However, Captain Blackwood's attempts to influence the ship's operations continued throughout the night, with various historic elements of the bridge showing signs of unexplained activity. The brass compass housing spun wildly despite the modern electronic systems showing stable readings, and the historic brass telegraph repeatedly moved to full ahead, despite being disconnected from the ship's actual propulsion controls. The most terrifying incident occurred near dawn when Captain Blackwood appeared to gain more substantial influence over the ship's systems. The Atlantic Majesty suddenly increased speed and began turning toward the heart of the storm, despite the bridge officers' attempts to maintain the safer course. For nearly 10 minutes, the modern navigation system seemed to be overridden by some force that was determined to take the ship directly into the most dangerous weather conditions. The crisis was resolved when the ship's chief engineer, a woman named Officer Martinez, who had 20 years of experience with maritime electronics, realized that the ship's historic elements were somehow interfering with the modern systems. She ordered the power to be temporarily disconnected from the bridge area that contained the Britannica's original components, effectively isolating them from the ship's operational systems. As soon as the historic elements were electrically isolated, the ship's modern systems regained full control, and the vessel returned to its safe course. Captain Blackwood appeared one final time as we safely passed around the storm system and resumed our original schedule. He seemed weakened and less substantial than before, as if the disconnection of the historic elements had diminished his ability to interact with the physical world. He expressed disappointment that modern officers lacked the courage to face challenging conditions, and he warned that ships like the Atlantic Majesty would never achieve their full potential until they were commanded by officers who understood the true meaning of seamanship. His final words to me were a warning that the Atlantic Majesty carried within her the soul of the Britannica, and that someday she would complete the voyage that had been interrupted by the storm in 1934. He insisted that the ship's destiny was to prove that superior seamanship could overcome any weather conditions, and that her historic elements would continue to seek opportunities to demonstrate this principle. As he spoke, his image became increasingly translucent until he simply faded away, leaving me alone on the bridge with only the historic ship's wheel and compass as evidence of our encounters. The remainder of our cruise was completed without further incident, though I noticed that the ship's officers maintained increased security around the bridge and seemed particularly cautious when making operational decisions. Officer Martinez privately admitted to me that they had experienced similar problems with the historic elements during previous voyages, though the incidents had never been as severe or sustained as what occurred during the storm. When I returned to my research at the University of New Mexico, I delved deeper into the history of Captain Edmund Blackwood and the final voyage of the SS Britannica. What I discovered confirmed my worst fears about the presence I had encountered aboard the Atlantic Majesty. Captain Blackwood had indeed been obsessed with maintaining schedules and proving the superiority of aggressive seamanship over cautious navigation. His refusal to acknowledge the limitations imposed by weather and mechanical systems had not only cost him his life, but had also condemned him to an eternal quest to complete the voyage that his arrogance had made impossible. The experience aboard the Atlantic Majesty taught me that some elements of maritime history carry more than just physical remnants of the past. When ships are built using materials from vessels that met tragic ends, they may also inherit the unfinished business and unfulfilled obsessions of those who died with them. The dead, I learned, do not always rest peacefully, especially when their final moments were defined by stubbornness, pride, and the refusal to accept defeat. Today, I continue my research into maritime history, but I am much more cautious about the vessels I choose to study. The Atlantic Majesty remains in service, though I understand that the cruise line has since removed many of the historic elements from operational areas of the ship. Captain Blackwood may still be aboard, waiting for another opportunity to prove that his way of seamanship was correct, but at least he no longer has direct access to the systems that could allow him to endanger modern passengers in pursuit of his obsessive goals. My name is Dylan O'Brien, and I have been working as a waiter aboard cruise ships for the past 4 years. I grew up in Boston, Massachusetts, where my family ran a small restaurant in the North End for 3 generations. Working in the hospitality industry was second nature to me. But when the family restaurant closed during the pandemic, I decided to take my skills to sea and explore the world while earning a living. The pay was decent, the travel opportunities were incredible, and I enjoyed the structured environment of cruise ship dining operations. I joined the crew of the Oceanic Serenity in March of 2023, assigned to work in the main dining room during the dinner service. The ship was one of the newer vessels in the fleet, accommodating nearly 3,000 passengers across 14 decks. The main dining room was an impressive space with soaring ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and seating for over 800 guests across 2 levels. During dinner service, the room buzzed with conversation, laughter, and the gentle clink of silverware against china as passengers enjoyed their meals while the ship glided through whatever waters we happened to be crossing. The dining room operated on a traditional cruise ship schedule, with 2 dinner seatings each evening at 6 p.m. and 8:30 p.m. I was assigned to the early seating, serving a section of approximately 30 tables in the starboard area of the main level. My passengers were a mix of families, couples, and solo travelers, most of whom were friendly and appreciative of good service. The work was demanding, requiring quick movement between tables, precise timing for course service, and the ability to maintain a pleasant demeanor even when dealing with difficult guests or kitchen delays. During my first few weeks aboard the Oceanic Serenity, I noticed a particular group of passengers who always dined together at a large round table in the center of my section. The table was set for 8 people, and the same individuals occupied it every evening during the 6 p.m. seating. What struck me as unusual was not their consistency in dining together, but rather their behavior during the meal service. Unlike every other table in the dining room, this group never seemed to actually eat their food. The 8 passengers at the table appeared to be 4 couples, all middle-aged to elderly, well-dressed in formal cruise attire that seemed slightly outdated compared to what other passengers typically wore. They would order from the menu each evening, making selections that suggested normal appetites and preferences. However, when I delivered their courses, they would arrange the food on their plates, cut it into smaller pieces, and move it around as if eating. But I never observed any of them actually consuming anything. More peculiar was their conversation, which was conducted entirely in whispers so quiet that I could never make out individual words despite standing directly beside their table while serving. They would lean toward each other across the table, speaking in urgent, hushed tones while occasionally glancing around the dining room as if concerned about being overheard. Their body language suggested intense discussion, but the volume was so low that their conversations were completely inaudible even during the quieter moments between courses. Initially, I assumed this group might have special dietary restrictions or cultural practices that I was not familiar with. Some passengers brought their own medications or supplements that affected their appetites, and others had religious or cultural reasons for unusual dining behaviors. I made sure to provide them with exceptional service, checking frequently to ensure they had everything they needed, and offering assistance with menu modifications or special requests. However, as the weeks progressed, I began to notice more disturbing aspects of their dining behavior. Not only did they never eat their food, but they never drank their beverages either. Water glasses remained full, wine went untouched, and coffee grew cold without being consumed. At the end of each meal, their plates would be artfully arranged to look as if food had been eaten, but the total quantity on each plate remained essentially unchanged from what I had originally served. What made this behavior even more unsettling was the fact that other passengers in the dining room began to take notice of the mysterious group. I observed diners at nearby tables glancing over with obvious curiosity, and some even changed their conversation topics to whisper about the strange behavior they were witnessing. The group seemed oblivious to this attention, continuing their whispered conversations and elaborate food rearrangement ritual, without acknowledging that they had become a source of fascination for other guests. The situation escalated during my 5th week aboard the ship when I noticed that the group was growing larger. What had started as 8 passengers had somehow expanded to 10, then 12, and eventually 16 people crowded around what had originally been a table for 8. The additional guests appeared to be other passengers from the dining room who had quietly joined the group, abandoning their original tables to participate in whatever was happening at the center table. The new additions to the group immediately adopted the same behavior patterns as the original members. They stopped eating their food, began communicating only in whispers, and spent the entire meal period engaged in the same mysterious discussions. Most disturbing was the fact that these passengers seemed to lose their individual personalities once they joined the group, becoming indistinguishable from the original members in terms of their mannerisms and behavior. As more passengers joined the center table, the atmosphere in the entire dining room began to change. The normal sounds of conversation and laughter grew quieter, replaced by an unusual tension that made both guests and staff members uncomfortable. Other diners began finishing their meals more quickly and leaving the dining room earlier than usual, as if eager to escape the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to emanate from the growing group. The most alarming development came during my 7th week aboard the ship, when I realized that every passenger who joined the mysterious group was staring directly at me throughout the entire meal service. Regardless of where I was in the dining room or which table I was serving, I could feel their collective gaze following my movements. When I looked in their direction, all 16 pairs of eyes would be fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Their staring was not casual or intermittent, but constant and unwavering. Even when I was serving tables on the opposite side of the dining room, I could sense their attention focused on me like a physical weight. The feeling was so oppressive that I began making excuses to leave the dining room during service, taking frequent breaks in the galley or finding reasons to assist other waiters in different sections of the ship. The situation reached a crisis point when I discovered that the group's influence was spreading beyond the main dining room. Passengers who had joined the mysterious table began appearing in other areas of the ship, always in small clusters, always engaged in the same whispered conversations. I encountered them in elevators, corridors, and public spaces, standing in small groups and watching me with the same intense, unwavering stare. Most terrifying was the realization that these passengers were no longer participating in any of the ship's normal activities. They did not attend shows, visit the casino, participate in deck activities, or go ashore at ports. Instead, they seemed to spend all their time either at the dining room table or standing in small groups throughout the ship, engaged in their endless whispered discussions while maintaining their constant surveillance of my activities. The breaking point came during a dinner service in my 8th week, when I approached the center table to take their orders and discovered that none of them would speak to me directly. Instead of providing their meal selections, they simply stared at me in complete silence while continuing their whispered conversations among themselves. When I asked specific individuals what they would like to order, they acted as if I were not there, looking through me as if I were invisible. Despite their refusal to place orders, the kitchen somehow received instructions to prepare meals for the entire group. When I asked the head waiter how the kitchen knew what to prepare, he looked confused and insisted that I had submitted the orders myself through the normal system. However, I had no memory of taking any orders from the group, and I certainly had not entered anything into the ordering system. The meals that arrived from the kitchen were unlike anything I had seen served in the dining room before. Instead of the standard cruise fare, the plates contained elaborate presentations of food that looked beautiful but somehow artificial, as if they were made from wax or plastic rather than actual ingredients. The colors were too vibrant, the textures too perfect, and the arrangements too artistic to be normal food. When I delivered these strange meals to the center table, the group members began their usual ritual of rearranging the food without eating it. However, this time their movements were perfectly synchronized, as if they were performing a carefully choreographed dance. Every cut, every movement of the fork, every gesture was executed in perfect unison by all 16 members of the group. As I watched this synchronized performance, I began to understand that what I was witnessing was not a meal at all, but some kind of ritual. The whispered conversations, the refusal to eat, the constant staring, and now the synchronized movements all pointed to a purpose that had nothing to do with dining and everything to do with some darker objective that centered around me. The ritual reached its climax when all 16 members of the group suddenly stopped their synchronized movements and turned to stare at me with an intensity that was physically painful. For the first time since I had been serving them, they spoke in normal voices, and their words chilled me to the bone. In perfect unison, they said, "We have been waiting for you to understand. Now that you do, you can join us willingly, or we will find another way to make you part of our purpose." I fled the dining room immediately, abandoning my section and my responsibilities to the other passengers I was supposed to be serving. I went directly to the crew quarters and requested an immediate meeting with the ship's security officer, a woman named Commander Hayes who had 20 years of experience dealing with unusual passenger behavior. When I explained what I had experienced, she listened with obvious concern and promised to investigate the situation immediately. Commander Hayes accompanied me back to the dining room, but when we arrived, the center table was empty and set for normal service as if nothing unusual had ever occurred. The 16 passengers who had been part of the mysterious group were nowhere to be found, and the other diners in the room were behaving normally, enjoying their meals and engaging in typical cruise ship conversations. Over the following days, Commander Hayes conducted a thorough investigation, reviewing security footage and interviewing other staff members who worked in the dining room. However, the surveillance cameras had somehow malfunctioned during the exact time periods when the mysterious group had been present, showing only static or blank screens during those crucial hours. None of the other waiters or dining room staff had any memory of the unusual behavior I described, insisting that the center table had been occupied by normal passengers throughout the cruise. I completed my contract aboard the Oceanic Serenity, but I never returned to work in the main dining room. For the remainder of my time on the ship, I was reassigned to room service and specialty restaurant duties, positions that kept me away from the main dining area where I had encountered the mysterious group. I never saw any of the 16 passengers again, though I occasionally felt the familiar sensation of being watched when I walked through certain areas of the ship. When I disembarked at the end of my contract, I decided to leave cruise ship work entirely and return to land-based restaurants. The experience had taught me that some forms of hospitality service can expose workers to dangers that have nothing to do with difficult customers or demanding schedules. There are passengers, I learned, whose intentions extend far beyond enjoying a vacation cruise, and whose presence on a ship can transform a normal dining room into something much more sinister and threatening. To this day, I cannot explain what the mysterious group wanted from me or what their ritual was intended to accomplish. I only know that their constant surveillance and synchronized behavior was designed to recruit me into something that I had no desire to understand or participate in. The sea, I discovered, attracts not only travelers seeking relaxation and adventure, but also those pursuing darker objectives that require the isolation and enclosed environment that only a cruise ship can provide. My name is Amber Richardson, and I work as a safety officer aboard cruise ships specializing in emergency evacuation procedures and passenger safety training. I grew up in Detroit, Michigan, where my father worked in automotive safety engineering, instilling in me a deep appreciation for the importance of proper safety protocols and emergency preparedness. After completing my degree in marine safety management, I joined the cruise industry because I believed that my skills could help protect thousands of passengers during their vacations at sea. I was assigned to the Pacific Majesty in January of 2023, a mid-sized vessel accommodating approximately 2,000 passengers and 800 crew members. As the ship's primary safety officer, my responsibilities included conducting mandatory lifeboat drills, training crew members in emergency procedures, and ensuring that all safety equipment was properly maintained and accessible. The work was demanding, but rewarding, as I knew that my diligence could mean the difference between life and death if a real emergency ever occurred. The Pacific Majesty operated on 7-night cruises through the Caribbean, departing from Miami every Sunday afternoon. This schedule meant that I conducted the mandatory passenger safety drill every Sunday evening, approximately 2 hours after departure when the ship had cleared the port and was heading toward open water. The drill was a federal requirement, mandating that all passengers receive instruction in the location of their muster stations and the proper use of life jackets before the ship could proceed to international waters. The lifeboat drill followed a precise script that I had memorized after conducting hundreds of similar presentations. Passengers would gather at their assigned muster stations throughout the ship. I would explain the emergency signal procedures, demonstrate the proper way to wear a life jacket, and review the evacuation routes from various parts of the vessel. The entire process typically took about 20 minutes, after which passengers were free to begin enjoying their cruise vacation. During my first several months aboard the Pacific Majesty, these drills proceeded exactly as expected. Passengers would listen with varying degrees of attention, some taking the information seriously while others treated it as an inconvenience to be endured before the real fun could begin. I maintained my professional demeanor and thorough presentation regardless of the audience's level of engagement, knowing that the information I was providing could save their lives in a genuine emergency. The first indication that something was wrong came during my 4th month aboard the ship, in April of 2023. As I was conducting the routine lifeboat drill, I began experiencing vivid mental images that had nothing to do with the standard safety presentation I was delivering. While explaining the location of life jackets, I suddenly saw a clear vision of the Pacific Majesty listing severely to port, with passengers screaming and rushing toward the lifeboats in panic. The vision was so realistic and intense that I momentarily lost track of my presentation, pausing mid-sentence as I watched the horrific scene unfold in my mind. The passengers at the muster station looked at me with concern, clearly noticing that something was wrong. I recovered quickly, apologizing for the brief distraction and continuing with the standard drill procedure. But the images remained vivid in my memory long after the presentation was completed. Initially, I attributed this experience to stress or fatigue. Working aboard a cruise ship involves long hours and irregular sleep schedules, and I assumed that my mind was simply processing the potential dangers that were always part of my professional awareness. However, during the next week's drill, the visions returned with even greater intensity and detail. This time I saw not just the general chaos of an emergency evacuation, but specific individuals among the passengers who were attending my current presentation. In my vision, I watched as Mrs. Henderson from Texas struggled to put on her life jacket correctly, exactly as she had struggled during the actual drill just minutes earlier. I saw Mr. and Mrs. Garcia from California helping an elderly gentleman reach his lifeboat, and I witnessed a group of college students from Florida who were initially making jokes about the drill but became terrified when the real emergency began. What made these visions particularly disturbing was their specificity and accuracy regarding details I should not have known. I saw passengers wearing clothing that I had not yet observed them in, and I witnessed interactions between people who had not yet met each other during the current cruise. The visions seemed to be showing me events that had not yet occurred but that felt absolutely certain to happen. As the weeks continued, my visions during the lifeboat drills became increasingly detailed and horrifying. I began to see not just the initial emergency and evacuation, but the tragic outcomes for specific passengers. I watched elderly passengers who could not move quickly enough being left behind as water rushed into lower decks. I saw families separated in the chaos, with children crying for parents who were trapped in different sections of the ship. Most heartbreaking of all, I witnessed passengers who died because they had not paid attention during my safety presentation and did not know how to properly use their emergency equipment. The emotional impact of these visions was devastating. I found myself becoming personally invested in the fate of passengers I was seeing in my mind, feeling responsible for their survival even though the disasters I was witnessing had not actually occurred. I began modifying my safety presentations, emphasizing specific details and procedures that I hoped would help the passengers I had seen struggling in my visions. However, my attempts to prevent the tragedy I was foreseeing seemed to have the opposite effect. The more detailed and urgent my safety presentations became, the more vivid and horrifying my visions grew. It was as if my increased awareness of potential dangers was somehow creating more opportunities for disaster to occur. I began to suspect that my visions were not just predictions of possible futures, but that they were somehow connected to my role in creating the very emergency I was trying to prevent. The situation reached a crisis point during a drill in my 7th month aboard the Pacific Majesty. As I was explaining evacuation procedures to a group of passengers, I experienced the most detailed and terrifying vision yet. I saw the ship not just listing and taking on water, but actually sinking with hundreds of passengers still aboard. I watched lifeboats being launched partially empty while other boats were so overloaded that they capsized shortly after hitting the water. Most disturbing of all, in this vision I saw myself on the bridge with the ship's captain, and I was the one insisting that we abandon ship immediately, even though the damage was not yet severe enough to warrant such drastic action. In my vision, my panicked overreaction to a manageable emergency situation caused a premature evacuation order that resulted in far more casualties than the original problem would have caused. The realization that I might be the cause of the disaster I was trying to prevent filled me with horror and confusion. I began to question whether my visions were warnings meant to help me save lives, or whether they were somehow self-fulfilling prophecies that would come true because of my own actions in response to them. The uncertainty was maddening, as I could not determine whether I should trust my visions and act on them, or ignore them completely to avoid creating the very disasters they depicted. My internal struggle became apparent to other crew members, who noticed that my safety presentations had become increasingly erratic and emotionally charged. The ship's captain, an experienced officer named Captain Morrison, called me into his office to discuss concerns about my performance and state of mind. When I tried to explain my visions and my fears about causing a disaster, he listened with professional courtesy but obvious skepticism. Captain Morrison arranged for me to meet with the ship's medical officer, Dr. Patel, who conducted a thorough evaluation of my mental and physical health. Dr. Patel found no medical issues that could explain my experiences, but she recommended that I take a temporary leave from conducting safety drills until I could resolve whatever psychological stress was affecting my performance. However, the ship's safety regulations required that a qualified officer conduct the mandatory lifeboat drills, and I was the only crew member aboard with the necessary certifications. Captain Morrison was faced with the choice of either allowing me to continue despite my obvious distress, or canceling the cruise and returning to port to arrange for a replacement safety officer. I convinced Captain Morrison to allow me to conduct one final drill, promising that I would maintain strict professional composure and follow the standard presentation exactly as written. I was determined to prove that I could overcome my psychological difficulties and continue performing my duties effectively. However, as I began the final drill, my visions returned with unprecedented intensity. This time I saw not just one possible disaster, but multiple overlapping catastrophes that all seemed to stem from different decisions I might make during the emergency. If I ordered an immediate evacuation, passengers would panic and trample each other while trying to reach the lifeboats. If I delayed the evacuation order, passengers would be trapped below decks as water flooded the lower levels. If I tried to maintain calm by understating the severity of the situation, passengers would not take the emergency seriously and would fail to follow proper procedures. Every possible course of action I could envision led to tragic consequences, and I realized that the disaster was not dependent on any specific decision I made, but was somehow inevitable regardless of my choices. The visions were not showing me how to prevent a catastrophe, but rather demonstrating that my very presence and involvement in emergency procedures was itself the catalyst that would cause the tragedy to occur. In the middle of my final safety presentation, I made the most difficult decision of my professional career. I stopped the drill, announced that I was experiencing a medical emergency, and requested that passengers return to their cabins while I sought immediate assistance. I then went directly to Captain Morrison and submitted my resignation, effective immediately. I explained to Captain Morrison that I could not continue in my role because I had become convinced that my presence was somehow connected to a future disaster involving the Pacific Majesty. While I could not provide rational proof of this connection, I was certain that removing myself from the safety procedures was the only way to prevent the tragedy I had been envisioning. Captain Morrison accepted my resignation with obvious relief, as my increasingly erratic behavior had become a source of concern for the entire crew. I was transferred to a supply ship at the next port and returned to Miami, where I took an extended leave from cruise ship work to recover from what I can only describe as a form of occupational clairvoyance that had made it impossible for me to perform my duties. 6 months after I left the Pacific Majesty, I learned that the ship had indeed experienced a serious emergency during a routine cruise. A fire had broken out in one of the engine rooms, requiring a partial evacuation of passengers from lower decks. However, the emergency was handled smoothly and professionally by my replacement, with no injuries or casualties occurring. The successful management of this real emergency confirmed my belief that my visions had been accurate in predicting danger for the Pacific Majesty, but that my removal from the safety procedures had somehow prevented the catastrophic outcome I had been foreseeing. Whether my visions were supernatural premonitions or psychological manifestations of professional anxiety, acting on them by removing myself from the situation had apparently saved lives. I never returned to cruise ship safety work after my experience aboard the Pacific Majesty. The incident taught me that sometimes the most important safety decision is recognizing when your own presence has become a danger to others. While I had dedicated my career to protecting passengers from maritime disasters, I learned that there are forms of danger that cannot be prevented through proper procedures and equipment maintenance, but only through the difficult wisdom of knowing when to step aside and let others take responsibility for outcomes beyond your control. My name is Marcus Thompson, and I work as an insurance claims adjuster in Salt Lake City, Utah. I had never been on a cruise ship before my wife convinced me to celebrate our 10th wedding anniversary with a 7-night Caribbean voyage aboard the Royal Paradise. At 42 years old, I considered myself to be in decent health, though I had been dealing with chronic seasickness concerns that made me somewhat apprehensive about spending a week on the ocean. My wife Sarah assured me that modern cruise ships were equipped with advanced stabilization systems and comprehensive medical facilities to handle any health issues that might arise during our vacation. The Royal Paradise was an impressive vessel, one of the newest ships in the fleet, featuring state-of-the-art amenities and a medical center that the cruise line proudly advertised as being equivalent to a small hospital. The medical facility occupied an entire section of Deck 3, with examination rooms, a pharmacy, diagnostic equipment, and even a small surgical suite for emergency procedures. As someone who worked in the insurance industry, I was familiar with maritime medical protocols and was reassured by the apparent quality and scope of the ship's healthcare capabilities. Our cruise began smoothly with perfect weather and calm seas that alleviated my concerns about seasickness. Sarah and I enjoyed the first 2 days exploring the ship, attending shows and relaxing by the pool. However, on the third morning, I woke up feeling nauseous and dizzy, symptoms that I initially attributed to motion sickness despite the ship's smooth sailing conditions. Sarah suggested that I visit the medical center to get medication that would help me enjoy the rest of our anniversary cruise. The medical center was located in a quiet section of the ship, away from the main passenger areas and accessible through a discreet entrance that was marked only with a small medical cross symbol. When I arrived at the reception desk, I was greeted by a nurse named Jennifer who was professional and courteous, taking down my information and symptoms with practiced efficiency. She explained that seasickness was a common complaint and that the ship's doctor would be able to provide medication that would resolve my discomfort quickly and effectively. Dr. Hamilton, the ship's chief medical officer, was a middle-aged man with an authoritative demeanor and impressive credentials displayed prominently on his office wall. He conducted a thorough examination, asking detailed questions about my medical history, current medications, and the specific nature of my symptoms. What struck me as unusual was his particular interest in aspects of my health that seemed unrelated to seasickness, including questions about my family's medical history, any previous surgeries, and whether I had ever participated in clinical trials or experimental treatments. After completing his examination, Dr. Hamilton explained that my symptoms were indeed consistent with motion sickness, but that he wanted to run some additional tests to rule out other potential causes. He mentioned that the ship's medical center was participating in a research study approved by maritime health authorities, and that passengers who consented to participate could receive enhanced medical care at no additional cost. The research, he explained, involved testing new medications and treatment protocols that could benefit future cruise passengers who experienced similar health issues. The consent forms Dr. Hamilton provided were extensive and filled with medical terminology that was difficult for me to understand completely. However, the basic premise seemed straightforward. I would receive free treatment for my seasickness in exchange for allowing the medical staff to monitor my response to the medication and collect data about its effectiveness. Dr. Hamilton assured me that the medications being tested were already approved for use and that the research simply involved comparing different dosages and administration methods. I signed the consent forms and was given what Dr. Hamilton described as an advanced anti-nausea medication that would be administered through an IV drip to ensure rapid absorption and maximum effectiveness. The treatment was to be conducted in a private room within the medical center, where I would be monitored for several hours to ensure that the medication was working properly and that I experienced no adverse reactions. The treatment room where I was taken was unlike anything I had expected to find on a cruise ship. It resembled a high-tech laboratory more than a typical medical facility, with sophisticated monitoring equipment, computer workstations, and medical devices that seemed far more advanced than what would be necessary for routine passenger health care. The walls were lined with charts and diagrams that appeared to be related to neurological and psychological research rather than maritime medicine. Nurse Jennifer started the IV drip and explained that the medication would take several hours to reach full effectiveness, during which time I would need to remain in the treatment room for observation. She provided me with reading material and assured me that I would be checked on regularly throughout the process. However, as the medication began to take effect, I noticed that it was causing side effects that seemed inconsistent with standard anti-nausea treatment. Instead of simply relieving my seasickness, the medication was causing significant changes in my perception and cognitive function. Colors appeared more vivid, sounds seemed amplified, and I began experiencing mild hallucinations that made it difficult to distinguish between reality and imagination. When I mentioned these effects to Nurse Jennifer during one of her check-ins, she assured me that they were normal temporary side effects that would subside as my body adjusted to the medication. As the hours passed, my altered state of consciousness deepened, and I began to suspect that whatever medication I was receiving was not a standard anti-nausea treatment. My thoughts became increasingly disorganized, and I found it difficult to maintain focus on simple tasks like reading or following conversations. Most disturbing was the realization that my memories of events from before the treatment were becoming unclear, as if the medication was affecting to access my own past experiences. During one period of relative clarity, I overheard a conversation between Dr. Hamilton and another medical staff member that revealed the true nature of what was happening to me. They were discussing dosages and monitoring protocols for what they referred to as experimental psychoactive compounds that were being tested on selected passengers without their informed consent. The research was not about seasickness medication at all, but rather involved testing the effects of mind-altering substances on unsuspecting subjects in the isolated environment of a cruise ship. The conversation I overheard made it clear that I was not the only passenger who had been subjected to these unauthorized experiments. Dr. Hamilton mentioned several other test subjects who were being monitored in different rooms within the medical center, and he discussed the need to ensure that none of the experimental subjects would retain clear memories of their experiences once the studies were completed. The medical staff were using the cruise ship's isolation and the passengers' trust in legitimate medical care as cover for conducting illegal human experimentation. As the medication continued to affect my cognitive function, I realized that my situation was far more dangerous than I had initially understood. The research study I had agreed to participate in was actually an elaborate cover for unethical medical experiments that could have permanent effects on my mental and physical health. The consent forms I had signed were likely fraudulent documents designed to provide legal protection for the researchers while concealing the true nature of their activities. Despite my impaired mental state, I knew that I needed to find a way to escape from the medical center and seek help from the ship's security officers or other authorities. However, the medication had left me physically weak and disoriented, making it difficult to move around or communicate effectively. When I attempted to leave the treatment room, I discovered that the door was locked from the outside and that I was essentially being held prisoner within the medical facility. My attempts to call for help using the room's intercom system were unsuccessful, as the medical staff claimed that I was experiencing medication-induced confusion and needed to remain under observation for my own safety. They insisted that my concerns about unauthorized experimentation were delusions caused by the anti-nausea medication, and that I would feel better once the treatment was completed. However, their explanations were contradicted by the sophisticated monitoring equipment and research materials that were clearly visible throughout the medical center. The situation reached a crisis point when I overheard Dr. Hamilton discussing plans to administer additional experimental compounds that would ensure I had no memory of my experiences in the medical center. The staff were preparing to give me what they described as memory suppression protocols that would allow them to release me back to my cabin with no recollection of the unauthorized experiments I had been subjected to. The realization that they intended to permanently alter my memory motivated me to make a desperate attempt to escape. During a period when the medical staff were distracted by other patients, I managed to disconnect my IV line and force open the locked door to the treatment room. Despite my weakened condition and disoriented mental state, I was able to make my way out of the medical center and reach the ship's main passenger areas, where I sought help from other cruise guests and crew members who were not connected to the medical facility. The ship's security chief, Officer Rodriguez, initially responded to my complaints with skepticism, as my medication-induced condition made it difficult for me to communicate clearly or provide coherent evidence of what had happened to me. However, when he accompanied me back to the medical center to investigate my claims, he discovered that Dr. Hamilton and his staff had hastily removed much of the research equipment and were attempting to destroy documents related to their unauthorized experiments. The investigation that followed revealed that the Royal Paradise's medical center had indeed been conducting illegal human experimentation on selected passengers, using the cover of routine medical care to test experimental medications and psychological manipulation techniques. The research was being funded by pharmaceutical companies that were seeking to develop new psychoactive drugs without going through proper clinical trial protocols or regulatory approval processes. Dr. Hamilton and several members of his medical staff were arrested when the ship reached its next port, and the cruise line faced serious legal consequences for allowing unauthorized medical research to be conducted aboard their vessel. However, the full extent of the experimental program was never fully disclosed, as many of the research documents had been destroyed, and some of the affected passengers had received memory suppression treatments that made it impossible for them to provide complete testimony about their experiences. The long-term effects of the experimental medications I was subjected to included persistent memory problems, difficulty concentrating, and occasional episodes of disorientation that continued for months after the cruise ended. Medical experts who examined me were unable to determine exactly what substances I had been given or to predict the full scope of their long-term impact on my health. The insurance settlement I eventually received provided some financial compensation, but could not restore my complete cognitive function or erase the trauma of discovering that a luxury cruise had become a cover for illegal human experimentation. The experience taught me that even in seemingly safe and regulated environments like cruise ships, there are individuals who will exploit the trust and vulnerability of innocent people for their own purposes. The isolation of being at sea, combined with passengers' natural trust in medical professionals, created the perfect conditions for unethical researchers to conduct experiments that would have been impossible in land-based medical facilities where patients have more legal protections and oversight. To this day, I cannot be certain of everything that was done to me during those hours in the Royal Paradise's medical center, as my memories of the experience remain fragmented and unclear. What I do know is that the cruise industry's promise of luxury and safety can sometimes mask darker realities that passengers never imagine when they book their dream vacations. The ocean, I learned, can provide not just isolation from the outside world, but also isolation from the legal and ethical protections that we take for granted in our daily lives. The Royal Paradise continues to operate cruises, though with a completely new medical staff and enhanced oversight of their healthcare operations. However, the incident raised troubling questions about how many other cruise ships might be providing cover for similar unauthorized activities, and whether passengers can ever truly trust that their medical care at sea is being provided in their best interests, rather than for the benefit of those who see them as convenient test subjects for dangerous experiments.